Plus, Ultra presents The Grey Lodge, Micheal Hudson's The Temples of Enterprise, Arc 1 of Friday Night Gnostic Book Club. One of your co-hosts, Jin the Ninja. I host a show called Threshold Saints, of which every single person on this panel is also a co-host and has also been on. Eros is still waiting for her two-part episode to drop, but it will be really soon. Obviously, I'm joined by Solar Exile, Professor Exile, Joshua the Branch, Eros to Ethos. Of course, check her out, Eros Up. And tonight so let's start with Seth. Seth is our little Naga. He has joined us many times in the past, or quite a few times in the past. Although this is Solar's choice, I just want to put that out there right now. This was like a book that I kind of was like, yo, this is might be cool. What do you think? And he was like, yeah. And I was like, okay, well, then we'll do this. But it was suggested to me by Seth, obviously, and also Dawnlander, because of you guys being ACP adjacent. Both of you were excited about it. So I was like, okay, this will be cool. It'd be like a very discursive episode where I don't have to be discursive necessarily. So anyways, that is where we're at. So everybody's links are in the show notes, as they always are. I've updated them. So Eros has her Substack, her YouTube. Solar has his Substack, his X. Joshua the Branch obviously has his X, but he also has his other podcasting work. I've got lots of episodes waiting in the can, in the archive for everybody to drop. The next Threshold Saints episode, aside from the one I just dropped with Mac, who's also part of our group, is with Cassandra, who's in the chat right now. So that will be on Monday morning. You will see a fresh episode with Cassandra. And then after that, I will be dropping the episode either with Parker Longbow or Max Rex. I haven't decided, but so that's basically it. And we will do this in 3 arcs, and it will be at Solar's scheduled discretion. So it will be in 3 arcs, but we'll see where we go, and we'll see how much we get through. And I think that'll be interesting. I told him the first, we'll do 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. I think that'll be a good, at least introductory point to getting through the material. I'm going to add Eros back. And I want everybody to, of course, shout themselves out and introduce themselves in the ways that they want to. But I just want a special shout out Dawnlander, because he really did have something come up, but he did plan to come for weeks. And so if he's listening, Dawnlander, write down your questions, and you can either send them in next week or hopefully you can come. So let me just put that out there. So thanks everybody for coming. The Grey Lodge has been doing great. We do great numbers, and I don't care about any of that. I really don't. It's really about me being able to record with 3 to 5 people that I actually am friends with and think are amazing and brilliant and all of that stuff. They all know, so I don't need to, Anyways, I'll let Solar go first since he's listed next, but there's no real preference, I'll say. I mean, yeah, of course, there's everybody's equally preference. So Solar, why don't you introduce yourself and say anything you want to say, and then if Joshua's not here, I'll let Eros do it, then Seth.
Yeah, I'm gonna dip to the back of the stack as I check chat. I will introduce myself last. Thank you.
You are most welcome. No problem at all. Okay, so let's do Seth. Or let's or I guess Eros. Eros just dropped in. Okay. Eros, introduce yourself, plug your YouTube and your Twitter and your Substack, which is all included in the links. And thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I don't have much to plug. I haven't been making much content lately, but I just started kind of getting back into it a little bit. Regardless, my YouTube is Eros Up, and my Twitter is Eros to Ethos. And honestly, I forget what my Substack is, but it's in the links.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Eros. And yes, it is in the link. And regardless of how much content you've been currently producing, you're a great content producer, and we all appreciate you and appreciate that you invited the 3 boys, especially, on your show and had a mini interview series with all of us. And I thought they turned out so phenomenal. So thank you so much for that, and all the stuff that you do and teaching us about Platonism and the astrology style that you use, which is very, I like it a lot, and I feel like it's very close to K-ball. So thank you again. And Joshua, are you here? I don't know if Joshua's here. No. Okay. Okay, Solar's back. So let's do Solar and then let's let Solar go. I'll let Solar go, sorry. And then Seth can go. And I'll do Joshua myself. Or I'll plug in myself. Solar, go ahead.
Hey guys, yeah, sorry about that. It's an exciting day at the Solar Estate. That was the fire department. They said their best. Yeah, so I'm Solar Exile, kind of contemporary LHP guy, a little bit of Dzogchen here and there. Yeah, so I have episodes in the stack. I'm waiting to plug some writing on other people's like Substacks and stuff, but that's kind of I'm waiting on that. A lot of stuff in the can, kind of as always on multiple fronts. But hey, it comes out when it's ready, I suppose. Happy to be here, stoked to be doing this book. This is a wonderful suggestion by Jin, and yeah, I'm really excited to hear where everyone kind of wants to take this discussion. In the Grey Lodge direction.
Well, I mean, it is a basketball like keynote, right? And so it makes sense if I'm going to discuss a socio-political text or whatever this is, socioeconomic, whatever, at least I can throw in some K-ball. So thank you so much, Solar, for coming. Obviously, we really appreciate you. You're axial to the space and to also Saints, as you all are. But, Solar knows he's kind of pivotal. So thank you guys. Appreciate it. And Seth, why don't you plug yourself, at least plug your episode that's upcoming on Saints with Josh, and anything else that you want to say. If you don't want to say anything, that's fine, but just give people because this is your first YouTube, right? So at least say, yo, I'm this guy, this is what I'm about, and yeah, say something. Seth.
So I've done a few podcasts with Jid before about video games. The first one about Dark Souls, and the second one about Elden Ring with Joshua as well. As to what I am, I mean, I'm just here for the hell of it. Like, I'm just friends with y'all. We discuss interesting things. As for Hudson, of course, coming from, I suppose, the general online milieu which I inhabit, Hudson is a big name. Temples of Enterprise and Forgive Us Our Debts, anything by Hudson, really. I love Micheal Hudson, so I will leap at the chance to discuss his works with anybody, really. So yeah, that's why I'm here. Super stoked to talk about Temples of Enterprise, especially. This is like my favorite work by Micheal Hudson.
Well, in honor of your presence, Seth, I'd like everyone, when we're talking about divine kings or divinized kings who have the sort of heavenly prerogative to declare debt jubilees, I want us to imagine Haz al-Din dressed up and sort of apportioned in Chaldean regal attire with one of those like silly little beards and everything, right? Like that's the vision.
La Cosmos Xi Jinping.
Jin, the double mute thing is gonna kill you tonight. I think. I think you might just have to flow.
Oh my God, you're totally right. It is going to murder me. So what I'll do is I'll just do it on the screen. I won't actually mute my mic. So my total apologies. Josh just popped back in. So oh shit, I just removed him. There we go. My bad. And Eros, sorry about that, Eros. Okay, Josh, say anything you want to say about yourself and plug while I try and not picture Haz al-Din wearing a Chaldean priestly garb. And oh, Josh just left again. Okay, so I will plug Josh while he comes or whatever he's doing. Josh is a great podcaster, Joshua the Branch. He does lots of things. He works with me and King of Cups from Chris from King of Cups primarily, and he often does things with Mario from Symbolic Studies. So I'm sure he's got lots going on with that. And I think this will be an interesting I think it is an interesting text, and I think it's a totally different direction than we normally go, but I actually feel like there's enough metaphysics. And let me just say, for the record, I am not a Near East studies person. I didn't even take one Near East studies class in my whole, time at university or anything like that. I know very little about the region. So it's kind of like AP world history a little bit. Like I'm having to really search my memory for, material ground for these things, but I think it'll be really cool. Okay, Josh can hear now. Let's bring you up. Okay, Josh, plug yourself in any way that you want to plug. Do not forget to unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me? Meow.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so yeah, thanks so much for being patient with me. At any rate, yes, my name's Joshua. You can find me on Twitter as cosplaying as William Birkin, the Umbrella Mad Scientist. Anyway, I don't have any recent projects, but we did release something on Threshold Saints not long ago for Elden Ring. And then I did do something with King of Cups the other day, maybe a few weeks back. And we did like a Dark Maga update. We're due for another one now that they've released the Centaur AI robots. So it's starting to sound like stuff out of the Book of Revelations. So yeah, it's hard to keep up sometimes. But anyway, thanks for having me. And I got the book up, so I'm ready to roll.
Awesome. So it is the Aeon of Sagittarius, let me just say. So Dark Mag is right on metaphysical point with that. Okay. So Solar, since this is really your book club, like, yeah, I'm the, moderator or whatever, but it is really your book club. So either you or Seth, why don't you introduce it for us if you want, and I will, be the peanut gallery for once and add in anything I think is interesting.
Sure. Yeah. Okay, so this is my first go around, so it's actually cool not being the sort of senior panelist in terms of like subject matter like expertise, right? Like I can kind of introduce it and maybe facilitate the initial discussion. But I guess from the sounds of it, that would be Seth, right? We expect nothing less of our ACP brethren. Yeah, so this book is there's sort of like a couple main points. So on one hand, this book is a sort of like brutal historical takedown of certain sort of like mythological histories around the origin of, well, money and credit lending. I like the financial technology of like lending and interest, etc. That might not be like as relevant to us, but if you took like, so I took a little bit of economics when I was an undergrad, right? And you're given a sort of a certain telling of history, right? About like how people, like free individual autonomous people came to kind of discover the concept of money in through barter exchange, right? And how we progressed from a barter economy to a currency-based economy. And it turns out that is not just a complete fiction, but it's a sort of politicized fiction, right? It's an ideological mythological fiction, right? And so one of the aims of this book is to annihilate that, right, and sort of like document all of the sort of like counter evidence, right, for that thesis. So that's really interesting. We'll explore that a little bit, I think. But the bulk of the text besides that, right, is it's a series of articles, right? It's a series of academic journal articles that are sort of strung together to make a book, and it essentially traces the development of both currency and credit as a social technology to the temple complexes of the Near East. And basically it kind of like inverts the traditional picture of the sort of like progression of monetary technologies from barter all the way, starting with like barter and then ending in a sort of like rich sort of credit-based system, right? It swaps that exactly around, right? It says that credit comes first, and it shows how that emerges. It shows the particular types, the particular uses of currency in the sort of initial phases going back through like, cuneiform records and things like that to show how currency, which was originally minted at the temple complexes and then later at the palace complexes throughout the Near East and Eastern Mediterranean world, spreading later to Greece and Rome, etc. Like what money was actually used for, because it wasn't everything. It wasn't even most things in the lives of most people in these civilizations for thousands of years. And then we kind of end up at the end of the civilizational cycle and the sort of the cycle of fiscal social collapse. We end up in the world of barter. And then I guess finally for this part of the book, the author has a lot to say about the centrality of regular cyclical debt relief, debt jubilee. And the sort of, he doesn't have a lot to say about the sort of like metaphysics of that. I think our group will probably have a little bit more to say about the kind of sort of social spiritual component of that, of how that operated. But yeah, the idea was that debt forgiveness was certain types of debts, agricultural debts, etc., were a critical component to guaranteeing the long-term social and economic stability of civilizations in Chaldea and the Eastern Mediterranean. Like, and again, these are sort of civilizational units that lasted for thousands of years. I mean, a very, very long time if you include Sumer, and then like the later all the way through Chaldea, and then like we're talking about like 3,000 years plus. So, yeah, we can maybe go from there. I don't know if anyone else thinks there's important sort of overview stuff to cover.
That was great. Thank you so much, Solar. Appreciate that. I know I kind of put you on the spot, but I knew you were ready, so I knew you're up for it. I want to actually posit a question. How does everybody feel, or like, maybe that's not a good way to phrase it, but how does the panel, and meaning that everybody can and should answer, how do you feel about his sort of repositioning of the chronology of the history of barter or credit? Like, do you agree with it? Do you disagree with it? And even if you haven't read anything of the book, just like from your gut feeling, like how does everybody sort of like interact with that and perceive that to be? Seth, why don't you go?
Solar mentioned the anecdote of us learning about economics for the first time in high school, and I think we all had this sort of like head scratching moment. We're like, wait, this all sounds like a bunch of bullshit. And the reason why I like Hudson so much, in particular Temples of Enterprise, is because he provides a very clear, straightforward, and like, as it was mentioned previously, sort of hammers the point over and over and again, like historical account of how money was actually created and what it was used for. As opposed to the liberal myth, where money arose out of barter, where in reality barter is just a signifier of collapse of a great civilization that had preceded it. So for me, it was like a sort of revelatory sort of text in that it sort of validated my gut instinct that a lot of what I was taught in school was kind of bullshit when it came to economics specifically. And then
I want to jump in and follow that. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Sorry. No. I thought you were done. So go ahead.
Oh, it just as like an additional like, really Hudson. The reason why I sort of like the infrared movement by large, and I think ACP in particular likes Hudson so much, is that these articles sort of form the foundation by which a criticism can be made of the contemporary moment, and especially cosmology, which is, I think, something everyone here is interested in, right? The great chain of being. Because it allows us to imagine a past, a present, a future that isn't solely dictated by like the logos of, for lack of a better term, neoliberalism. The stuff that like the vampire's castle, that sort of thing. It's like we could imagine a world beyond that.
Yeah, one of the most compelling sort of features of this initial, like, I'm going to call it cycle, because the book is kind of broken up into 3 major parts, and there are like, I think 5 chapters within the first part that we're going to discuss tonight. he drives this point home that debt is not considered sovereign or absolute until it passes relatively late in the sort of civilizational cycle. It's actually kind of making the jump from the Eastern Mediterranean, the sort of like Babylonian, Chaldean, even like Sumerian earlier world, to the Grecian and then Roman context. It's only in that last jump where, because of, again, sort of certain like social changes, you no longer have a sort of like divine regent who is capable of declaring debt forgiveness. And so it's only in like Greece and some of the Grecian islands, like, again, he's citing very specific pieces of evidence here, but it's, the overall picture is overwhelming. It's only in this later phase that we actually lose the ability to regularly forgive debts, right? Like, this was something that was baked into the cake for thousands of years. And so not only is it like, I'm just extending what Seth said, where it's like, it's not only is it possible to sort of envision another world, but he makes a very strong case that, at least in sort of like quantitative terms, the world in which we live now, which in this particular sense, in terms of the sort of like absolute sovereignty of debt obligations, this is actually a historical like deviation, right, from a sort of system that was stable for thousands of years. What I was going to follow up with, and I'm sorry for accidentally interrupting. So I think I've shared previously that both my parents were in finance, right? I had to work very hard to not follow in the footsteps of that profession, right? Because I was kind of raised from birth to think in those terms. So where Seth, Seth's a smart guy, right? So he heard these things in high school and said, this something smells here, something's off. I encountered these concepts sort of like natally, right? I grew up, I could explain marginal efficiency by the time I was like 6 years old, right? I was trained for this. And so because I'm fluent in these ideas at a very like, kind of foundational level, I also just accepted them, right? Like, I had no other frame of reference but to sort of imbibe these myths. And so where Seth was encountering something that he at least intuitively expected, I was not, right? So I have lived my whole life, even though like I, was no longer thinking like a sort of like finance person, right? Even though I spent most of my 20s as, a sort of radical leftist, I nonetheless had never kind of fully unseated a lot of sort of baseline assumptions, these sort of axioms that I was still kind of bringing to the table, even in a like semi-conscious way, right? Even for me still, the sort of the account of the emergence of currency as a way to efficiently store and transport and exchange surplus value, right? The idea that precious metals and gemstones, right? But let's just say precious metals are an extremely dense way to store surplus value, which makes them conducive, and it doesn't decay generally, right? Like, unless you're a Spartan treating your iron with vinegar so that the money is brittle and and stuff like that. You can keep a block of silver or gold or coin, even before coins, but you can keep these metals around in a storehouse, and they're relatively stable, and you can haul a brick, right, of a precious metal, and that is worth a tremendous amount of other goods in exchange, right? And so that account that essentially this was sort of innovated privately, independently, probably many, many times over the course of human history, that's something that like I even still struggle with uprooting, right? Like, even though the evidence presented in this book so far has been extremely convincing that that's just literally not how it happened. Like, none of the archaeological evidence points to that as being the actual origin of precious metals being exchanged, right? Even like as proto-currency and then later as currency. Even that, it's very, very deep seated. So I just want to say that, like, we're not all necessarily in the position that Seth was fortunate enough to find himself in. So props to him.
Well, like I said in the chat, oh, I can't say certain words because this is going to go on YouTube. My ignorance was my salvation, which is funny because you mentioned your background. I sort of come from a similar background, but I am exceptionally hard-headed. Which is kind of how I find myself in the situation that I am now, just in life generally. So it's a good thing you learned all those things, Solar, because now I am playing catch up, trying to learn those particulars, and I am not very good at it either. So it's all good, I think. I was just more critical of because when you ask them to explain just like basic questions, right? Like barter, for example. How do people get coins in the first place? Like, how do they know to count and measure things and express things in terms of exchange in the first place? Like, there had to have been an historical memory, right, of there actually being like a formal economy for that to be the case, because the natural I'm not natural. What preceded the temple economy, which I think Hudson explains in this book, or I'm misremembering, and he explains it in Forgive Us Our Debts. But at any rate, he explains that what preceded the temple was like a sort of not the longhouse, but like the opposite of the longhouse. You know, like the great patriarch, the father of fathers who manages all the families altogether. And trade is based on sort of mutual reciprocity and all the formalities that come along with that, which when replicated on like a macro stage, right, where it's like a bunch of families coming together, that then forms the basis for a civilization, like a temple for people to gather around and whatnot. And that's the real radical, the true radical break that he makes with the conventional narrative of like myth, which also makes the
Did we just lose Seth, or is it me?
The supposed antiquarians, like the Bronze Age people, it makes them very mad. Hudson makes them very mad because of this, because I think their fantasy of like being like an Ubermensch or whatever sort of depends upon this economic myth of barter as well. So that's why I like this book as well.
What I came to understand is, you know, we had the karmic system, and then during the age of Taurus, they kind of just traded cows and stuff, and they would keep ledgers of credits and debits on cows. And then you have the first coin, which was a very specific metal. It was a mix of gold and silver, I believe. I forget what they call it. Electrum or something like that. It had a very cool name. And it was the Lydian lion. So I wonder if he talks about that at all. And I find it very fascinating because, you know, people have different opinions about the monetary system. That money is a tool towards efficiency. I kind of think so, but I also think that it also shows us where maybe efficiency isn't always the best thing.
Thank you, Eros. That was
Can you
really
guys hear me
great.
okay?
Yeah, I can hear you, Solar. Do you want to say something? Go for it if you want to.
I can hear him as well.
Okay, sorry about that. I don't know, Solar. If you want to jump in, go for it, buddy. You know, it's totally fine. I just want to say 1K ball. Okay, relocate. Yeah, no problem. Okay, K-ball. I want to say something to Eros. Thank you for bringing up like the age of Taurus, because this is actually a really, well, no, I shouldn't say actually. It's axially an interesting way to think about the world, divided into the ages. Obviously, Solar mentions cycles, and so yeah, I would say I mean, he's not really an axialist, but he is positing a more like axial, axial system of cycle of time. So this obviously fits if you were looking at Central Asia, rather than Near East. So I'm not familiar enough with the Near East, but I did think the point about electrum was really important and really interesting because the color of electrum is, as everybody knows, I love the K-ball colors and I love Sephirotic colors in particular. So while solar's not here, I'll just say that electrum is actually supposed to be at its perfect state when it is found in nature. And yes, it is a naturally occurring alloy of both gold and silver in relatively equal proportion. It should be the color of rose gold with a lime green tint. So if you're familiar with me talking about the Aeonic colors of pink and green, slime green, well, there's something kind of interesting there. And, Chinese people also have a preference for rose gold. So this isn't really, and it's also very tiferatic, is what I should have said. It's very tiferatic. There's a green flashing and also a pink halo. So maybe, and then obviously when you can also mint electrum and it takes on a different coloration. Maybe this is like a different sort of process of alchemy because it's obviously it requires us in perception of it, working on it, and doing it. So it is our actual process of outer K-ball, we could say. So I do think it's interesting that it even takes on a different color quality then. And like the idea of the lion, that's very solar, like no pun, but obviously that goes with the idea of Tiferet because Tiferet is also relational to the sun. And I like what Seth said prior. And then I want Joshua to respond after I'm done, but I know, so I promise I'll be quick. But Seth said about like there's so all, in my opinion, so this is maybe just like my weird Magi on the Mountain opinion, which is fine if that's what people want to say. But I kind of think all anthropology and all archaeology tends to be very speculative. As I always say, all history is speculative. I do actually believe that. I think a lot of the mythologies and sort of the ways that we contextualize the stories of these others, I think it relates more to us and our sort of perceptions of the world rather than relates to them and necessarily how they lived or even perceived the world themselves. Well, we can never really know that, but how they perceive the world themselves. So I tend to take the idea that Micheal Hudson is also speculative, but it's more based in like a materialist, like a Marxist materialist, like dialectical history. And so people who have listened to the spaces for a long time will know that I've actually always said this. I think material science is important because it roots us in Malkuth and it roots us in the idea of actually like existing phenomena, like things that we can measure, test, quantify, and even qualify. We can't be strictly limited to that, which is also why in K-ball I say face upwards. So it's important to be informed by material science as well as like having the ability to be speculative later. So welcome back, Solar. And if you have anything you want to say, I tried to, fill the space. But I was gonna let Joshua go, but if you have anything to say, please go ahead.
No. Let Joshua go. I wanted to comment on something Arrow said, but we can circle back to it because it's not something that I was planning to address early about the about cattle as sort of proto currency, etc.
You might want to do that because I've been taking notes and I'm liable to derail things.
Okay, yeah, sure, real quick. So, yeah, there's a myth that extends well beyond like discussions of purely economic like considerations, right? That at least for the Aryan Indo-European peoples, right, for whom cattle and just like livestock grazing and raising was central to their way of life for thousands of years as they made their way westward. There's this idea that cattle were a sort of proto currency, and in fact, that cattle were the first, or perhaps among the first things that were actually lent out, right? So the idea would be that a certain number of heads of cattle would be lent out to a person in need, another party, and then they would be returned, at the end of some duration. And then all or at least some of the calves that were born, right, to those cattle would then be also like received by the lender, right? So you have like, baby cows as the interest on your loan of cows, right? And this is a very convenient idea also because that's like it's productive capital, right? And it's a sort of like productive, it's an account of lending, the origins of lending. That's explicitly sort of productive, right? It's the opposite of anything sort of destructive or predatory, etc. However, this also, and the reason I'm bringing it up at all, is this is also central to Dr. Stephen Flowers, i.e. Edward Thorson's account of the Fehu rune. For those of you who are interested in the Futhark, or the Northern Germanic mysteries, right? Paganism, etc. Right? Like you've no doubt encountered this. And again, it's not his idea exactly. He's just like the biggest rune guy, but there's many accounts. I'm just familiar with his work because it's kind of the default. They will repeat this idea, right, of cattle as sort of movable property, right, and as force, and it's this whole thing, right? Like their understanding of the Fehu rune, i.e., the F in the initial, the first row of Futhark, right, that gives the sort of runic alphabet, quote unquote, its name. They have this bit completely baked in. I've read dozens of accounts by different people that all kind of work through this idea, Flowers being the most extensive. And yeah, so it turns out that there's absolutely no evidence for this. He cites two sources. The Hudson cites two sort of additional sources that kind of explore the complete lack of evidence for this idea. In fact, the only sort of early records that we found of cattle being involved in credit at all are actually borrowers pledging some heads of cattle as collateral, right? So they're never extended as credit. They're pledged, if anything, as being, valuable objects of collateral with which to secure credit. So the complete opposite. So, which again is interesting because I initially thought, hey, maybe, nomadic pastoralists probably not recording their business transactions on the most durable of materials. These aren't city-dwelling Mesopotamians who are, pressing things on clay that gets fired, right? They're, I don't know, doing steppe nomad things, right? So maybe we just don't have any evidence at all. And it turns out there is, in fact, a lot less evidence of pretty much everything that these people were up to. But we do actually have some records, but they're going in the complete opposite direction of this ubiquitous account. And again, this is something with sort of direct magical or esoteric import in terms of sort of runic explanations, I guess. So I found that tremendously interesting as someone who has worked with the runes for a number of years. So just wanted to put that out there.
And to build off of that, the idea that he posits too, which is that like any cattle, any sort of like personal property or like livestock of that nature is like, if it was sort of pledged, is like is a matter of reciprocity. Like if there was any like exchange of cattle or livestock or anything like that, it played rather into the already pre-existing social norms of reciprocity and I think hospitality as well, which grants the nomads in particular an altogether different social character that aligns more so especially with like the myths that still sort of survive from that general sort of area, like the Sirat Beni Halal, the sons of Halal, I guess, recounts like the story of like the conquering of like Africa from these sort of like Arab nomad barbarians, right? So like the myths that survive that we have echo the theory that Hudson advances rather than the sort of cow lending myth of the merchants. So I just thought that I'd add that as like an interesting detail as well.
No, thank you both. I want to let Joshua go, but quickly, I want to say something about this. This is a coin from the Alcon Huns who moved into Central Asia and South India, all of South India. I mean, India is obviously in the south, but I mean, they moved from the north of India into the south. They brought with them their electrum coins, and notably, they also brought with them their religion, what later became the Shiva Tantras. So we were talking a lot about cows. I don't really have it as a form of credit, or as Solar posits, or as Micheal Hudson posits, as a form of collateral. So they obviously were cattle herders. I know the Indo-Aryans got thrown around, but these are the Huns. So where do they come from? Who knows? They don't even. There's theories. It's just speculative, right? But I thought their rune is also very interesting. That kind of eclipse of the sun. That is what that rune beside his face it represents. It's the temple of and then there's an eclipse happening. So it's either eclipse of the moon or eclipse of the sun. They were night sky worshippers or storm sky worshippers. So they believed that it was an eclipse of the moon, because the dark sky and the night sky and the day sky, are those all different? Well, that's an interesting idea, and that is addressed in the Bhairava Tantras, like um, like the sleeping god or the waking god, or the wrathful god. But it's the same, but they preference a specific kind. And I just think it's interesting because they're obviously bringing with them this lunar bull cult into like the Kashmir Valley, for instance, where a lot of Tantric Buddhism, Dzogchen, all those things, were arising at the same time. Sufism, ecstatic Kabbalah, yes. There's a lot of different things happening. It was like the Silk Road. I know this is a much later period than what Micheal Hudson's talking about, at least in a lot of what he's saying. But I think there's an interesting connection, like a kind of chronology or a linear history that makes sense, a trajectory of velocity, maybe you could say. Anyways, I'm sorry, Joshua, I'll put back up the regular keynote and be quiet. But Joshua, why don't you bring out your notes and we'll go through them.
Well, in fact, just keep that image of the coin up there, because I do have some notes here pertaining to something like coinage, which, by the way, that symbol reminds me of a symbol I've seen. I think, was it John Dee, maybe? There was some occultist or whatever that had like a Monas hieroglyphica or something, and it was like a combination of several astrological glyphs, and I always enjoyed looking at it and picking it apart. And yeah, I think eclipses are kind of included in that too, but because you can almost see almost like a Venus glyph in there too, anyway, sorry, I didn't want to get hung up on that, but
I was thinking it looked like an upside down Uranus.
I'm sorry, what was it?
It looks kind of like an upside down Uranus glyph.
Oh yeah, okay. So I didn't recognize that one, and it almost appears like a yoke as well. So for me,
Pluto or Uranus. Sorry, Josh. I would argue that it could be. I agree with Eros, but I think it could be either Pluto or Uranus. I think it could be. Yeah. I think it could be either or. I don't think it's necessarily definitive. But again, it is really about the eclipse of the moon. So it's like, how do we understand the planets? How do we understand the outer three to relate to them? This actually makes sense. What Eros said makes sense to the kind of way that, like we've discussed, mapping the outer three to Rahu Ketu. So if Rahu is indeed linked to Uranus in some way, that is the eclipse. And so that would make sense. So anyways, that's all I wanted to say about that. Sorry about that, guys.
Well, yeah, but I appreciate it, because I knew it probably had more possibilities, but I wasn't able to articulate it. But the whole concept of minting coinage, I feel like we maybe have glossed over that in the past. But, I like to kind of muse about the whole, where does the authority, the author part of that, I like to stress, the authority to mint a coinage is something that does kind of lie solely with the government structure, in some cases even the church a little bit, but they don't really like to have a hand in it directly, it seems. So
we got boundaries and things like that to consider. So I think there are elements of it that are somewhat Saturnian. There's elements of it that are Plutonian, like when it's undiscovered metals under the ground, for instance. I'm reminded of the stories of Solomon using Djinn or spirits or whatever to divine, using a divining rod to find elements in the ground, etc. But anyway, I could go on about a lot of different things, but what I did want to talk about was the cow, the beef, because I had a couple of things there I thought maybe were profound. So in the Bible, you could start a beef with somebody, quite actually, or in this case, literally. You would split the beef in two, and then you would have to pass through it. And so when they did covenants and stuff like that, if you're splitting a beef with somebody, that was a big deal, So that'd be like the equivalent today to like a contract, right? And so in Odinic traditions, for instance, they might even pass their hands through the Odin stone and then like clasp hands, and then Odin would be the witness or whatever. So a lot of times there's like a deity element there, kind of adding to the trust element or cementing it. So I think that's kind of interesting how the religiosity is ever present, even in like a pagan tradition, it seems. So you always got these like two things kind of riding together that go along with what we call money or currency. It's with these authorities and principalities. There's some level of authority to it, right? Even if a country has really small borders, it can still have that authority. So maybe there's like parts of the sky, that are able to project dominion, and dominions are like borders. I don't know. I don't want to get crazy. But the last thing I'll mention is that as far as Taurus being money, when we consider contracts, that's our word, and Taurus is the throat, which from where words come from. So I think there's probably a weird energetic spiritual connection with that. And I consider credit kind of like in video games, how you have fame or whatever, and if you're famous, things are maybe cheaper, etc. So if you got like good credit, you get a good interest on your loan or whatever, and some people don't even have interest. Anyway, go ahead. Thanks.
Yeah, so let me follow up on a couple of things there. Yeah, so the idea of cutting a covenant, like karat, in like biblical Hebrew, that is a practice and a notion that they inherited, right, from their kind of Near Eastern and Middle Eastern predecessor cultures, right? That's certainly not unique to the ancient Israelite notion, right? This idea of cutting a covenant, as you said, it goes back to the sort of sacral nature, like the fundamentally sort of like divine origin of the notion of entering sort of like into an agreement between parties, right? That in and of itself was a sacred act. And similarly, as far as the origin of the two metals in currency, right, gold and silver. One of the things that surprised me, and Hudson doesn't actually have a lot to say about this in this book, at least so far, but he proposes that essentially gold and silver were treated or were recognized, widely recognized in the Near and Middle East as sacred metals prior to acquiring any kind of sort of like function, like prior to them becoming sort of mediums of exchange, right? So it's funny, right? As like an occultist, you listen to him giving you this very quick gloss, right? Where the gold is this sort of metal associated with the solar, the sun, and so similarly silver for the moon and things like that. And he points to the very, very early association of these metals with the sort of like with the divine very generally. You see these metals in particular being used in sacred images, statues, and things like that, bracelets and necklaces that are sort of gifted to the temple either to basically pay for some kind of like tax assessment or just as a surplus gift. And then those like bracelets or the statues themselves even can then be melted down to, for instance, pay for mercenaries is a very common example that he cites. But the idea that again, like the thing that I found most interesting about that is that the sort of like sacred character of the metals preceded their later ubiquity as units of exchange, which is absolutely fascinating. Again, it totally challenged any assumptions that I might have brought to the table on that. And then with respect to the issue of the minting authority, right? Of course, we can discuss that, kind of conceptually and speculatively. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. That's kind of probably what you're here for if you've tuned into, Grey Lodge, right? But in terms of the actual historical record of that, I mean, boy howdy, we got the book right here for you if you're interested in that, right? Like he traces the development of minting authority originally from the temples to the palaces, right? So it's interesting, like we think about it in terms of a state, in terms of government, in terms of something that might be termed secular authority. And he actually lays out how originally it actually didn't lie with the government exactly. It was, these coins were minted for a very, very long time in the Near East and in like Greece and the Grecian colonies. They were minted at temples, and we can actually kind of see the progression in the Greek world when you started to see civil marks like the mark of the polis appearing, or an image of the polis, etc., appearing on the obverse side of the coin. So you would have a temple mark on one side and then a civil mark on the other, right? And that's almost like a degeneration, or I guess to say it more neutrally, it represents a sort of snapshot of the system in flux, right? As it developed. But again, that's depending on how you're counting, that's like 2,000 to 4,000 years into the system already, right? So it's at a very kind of late date. And just to be clear, so we're understanding this, because this isn't something I think I did a good job of establishing earlier. So one of the central innovations that the temple the temple complex is kind of developed was this system of exchange of calculating of exchange between silver and grain, right? Whether that's barley or, in most cases it would have been barley in this context. And so the way they denominated these units was like a drachma of silver was equal to 60 half-day rations, right? So because you would say 2 meals a day, so they would say the average amount of barley that it takes to feed a workman, right, twice a day over the course of a 60-day month, right? So 60 meals. That amount of barley is equal to 1 unit of our silver currency, right? And then you have like a shekel or something like that under, to be a smaller unit of exchange, right? And these prices were fixed, and they were developed not based on the actual going rate of exchange, i.e. in terms of like a market price being established, right? We think of like market price discovery. It's like, well, how, what's the demand for this, and, cost and all these things. That's not how it worked. Like these things were denominated for ease of accounting and to provide a sort of stable, consistent, like system of accounting. And it's brilliant, right? Because you can see at a glance, you can convert labor hours into like money in this really direct way, right? Because the prices are pegged to each other. And in fact, coins probably weren't used at all for like local matters, right? So you have laborers and farmers who are being extended credit earlier in the year as they're planting through the winter, et cetera, right? Because they don't have any way to pay things back, right? So they're sort of quote unquote buying, not really. I mean, they're being provided things like ale and the necessities of life and labor on credit, and then come harvest time, okay, now they're rich and they're able to pay that back. And also by having prices that don't fluctuate based on like an actual market, but by having them fixed, it prevents it prevents this situation where the market becomes flooded with grain right at harvest time, and then farmers are basically in this race to the bottom to sell off their product when there's this massive surplus, right? So it kind of it stabilizes the system. So anyway, you have this sort of grain-based system of credit and exchange operating at the local level. And then, so what do you need coins for? Well, they say, Hudson says, first, you're going to be, okay, so at these temple complexes, they're making use, this is the emergence of some of the first, essentially like workshop complexes where they would have taken in like orphans and widows and other, basically they would have marshaled this kind of like labor army, right, of like precarious people largely, employed them in workshops where they would have made things like textiles, right? But you can only use so many textiles in a given place. And so they would extend the products of these workshops to merchants on credit, right? They would basically front them the goods for a period of like a year, let's say, because interest rates were fixed at about 20% per annum. And then that merchant would go on his journey, he would come back, and then he would pay back the equivalent, right, of either in goods or in a currency, right, of what he had borrowed plus the wherever the interest, however long he'd been gone, but plus some interest, right? And it was actually only those foreign transactions, by and large, that were actually conducted. That's where you really need, right, because just the logistics, right, the effort, the inconvenience of like long distance trade, right? We don't have trucks, we don't have planes and ships, right? This is all like on the backs of camels and shit. So you need like the sort of like compressed value that can be used like precious metals, right? And that was actually the primary use, along with paying mercenaries who just wanted the coin, right? They also need the compressed value. Those were the primary uses of currency in the early Near East, not the sort of like local cyclical agrarian kind of business that included the majority of the population, which again is a fascinating picture, right? It's credit being dominant and antecedent to currency exchange. So
I think that makes a lot of sense in aeonic terms, personally. It would be very like, because agrarian cycles are linked to the aeon of the mother, and at least in the way I think of it. So yeah, it would both dominate and proceed. That makes complete sense to me. Anyway, no, that was super interesting. Thank you, Dr. Exile. We appreciate it. Obviously, a lot was said and everything interesting, but I wanted to sort of follow up with something we were talking about in our studio chat, I guess, is Eros was talking about like how money is very plutonic, and I agree. And so this is the plutonic sort of tantric deity. His name's Swarnakarshana Bhairava. You can see he's sitting on the void treasury, the treasury of the three worlds. I can't remember the Sanskrit name right at this second, but it is something about the Loka, meaning the multi-world, multiverse system. So it is a form of Shiva, and you can see the sun is behind him, but it's sort of you could say eclipsed by the temple. And then there's, of course, his crescent moon, which does not actually refer to the moon. I know this will upset all the Indians on Twitter, but it is actually in reference, very much like the Alcon Huns, the coinage that we showed before. It is about the eclipse of the moon. So there's a sort of innate element to the eclipse. Of course, he wears the Naga, the snake god Vasuki around his neck. And yeah, so he grants from heaven, he opens the void treasury of all three worlds. So heaven, earth, and hell. And he grants it to, you can see it's Kubera wearing the very Buddh-like, very mercurial colors, that green and that yellow. So actually in an earlier image, it's more orange pink. So that also makes sense. And then also the goddess Lakshmi, who is very much linked to Venus and to material wealth. So Swarnakarshana Bhairava is found in Buddhism. I didn't pull up a particularly Buddhist image, but I just want to point that out, is that he doesn't actually, it's not about material wealth per se. It is actually about the wealth of the three worlds. That's kind of a tantric metaphor. It's like, it's material wealth, of course, because he's opening the earth treasury, the treasury of the Nagas, but he's also opening the spiritual treasury, the karmic treasury of heaven. And he's also opening the hell treasury, which is the treasury of karmic debts. So you can see it's like he's granting it. And so Kubera, you can see this little, the fat little Yaksha guy. He's the deity of all the, he's the Yaksha king. Yeah, that's one way to understand him. I see Eros just came, Solar just jumped out. Anyways, so he is the Yaksha king, and he is the god of commerce. That's kind of how you should understand him. And his wife here is Lakshmi, and she is, in fact, the goddess of, as I said, material luxury. So anyways, I just wanted to sort of add to that and sort of give a Plutonic argument to the earlier discussion. But I do think it's interesting, coinage as an alchemical. I think that was perfectly said, Solar. Like, yeah, I agree with that. I think that makes sense. And also is the inverse of how it would work in Tantra too. Is like you would gift the statue gold leaf or silver leaf or money or gemstones or jewelry. This is a big part of Tantra, actually, is to gift the idol, but it's not necessarily the idol. It's more maybe the metaphysical potential of the offering. And so the offering of 5 metals is probably the highest, especially for Tantric Buddhism. I would say that's one of the highest forms of metallurgy, and like material alchemy is sort of the transmutation of the 5 metals, and then offering that to the deity. You know, and people and the temples would melt it down. Like in India, they still do this. They have these huge treasure vaults where they've, you know, accumulated hundreds of years of these offerings of jewelry. And one of the things the temples did, both in the earliest days, maybe in the the decline of the Buddhist monastic system, which was very much predicated on this same idea, was that people would donate gold and silver leaf, and then the monastery would actually own the rice paddies around. So this is obviously very different, maybe, than what Micheal Hudson's talking about, but this was the sort of temple economy of South Asia. So I think that's actually really interesting to sort of like, again, tie the thread through space, maybe the space of the Silk Road. Anyways, Seth, why don't you? I actually do have a question for Solar specifically, but it's open to all of you. How do you reconcile Micheal Hudson's more left-wing orientation with like your current orientation, or is it more about like the synthesis of ideas, or like how are you engaging with the text despite its maybe more it has a very specific sort of socio-political angle? Anyone go ahead.
Why don't you go ahead, Seth? I don't know if my mic is working.
Well, the great thing about Hudson is that, sort of like Solar, he is a money man. He worked for, I believe, the IMF and the World Bank for a while. So Hudson sort of develops this his contemporary understanding of the world by being a modern day priest, essentially. So all of his literature is sort of written from that perspective. I believe he is also the scion of Leon, not Leon, of Trotsky. So another interesting bit about the man. So, but as for the texts themselves, especially Temples of Enterprise, I mean, it's a very just objective, straightforward account of, you know, all the archaeological evidence that's been amassed over the years concerning that particular part of the world. So, I mean, I would say the thing that he drives home, right, like the conclusion that he really wants the reader to take away, is that debt is not this permanent thing. It's not like this blight on your soul, as, for example, the Catholics might have you believe, or that particular branch of Christianity. It was rather, it's literally just a tool. And it arises specifically out of this the social chain of being established in antiquity to manage the antagonism between the productive class of farmers and the menial class of priests and merchants, mediated by the king, specifically the palace. It's like a pyramid. On one side you have the farmers, the producers, or whatever. On the other side you have the priests and the merchants. And then in the absence of that authority, the merchants and the priests write up these contracts to indebt the farmer and enforce them to, you know, to pay interest on that, but to a point where that debt could not possibly be paid. You know, the math demands you must pay it, but the reality of the situation, whatever it is, if it's like a flood, for example, or if it's just simply too expensive after a certain period of time, the reality then becomes, instead of paying that debt, people enslave themselves, and then after a period of time, they just flee altogether. And then you don't have any farmers, and then you don't have any crops, and then there's no merchants or priests because there's no one, you know, supplying them with their necessities, the necessities by which they manage the whole broader economy of that civilization. So
May I enter? Well, I was going to just mention the faith element because you had it in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
So could you maybe consider that going forward as well?
Yes. What's interesting about that is that because the liberal conception of money is that it sort of begins with the government, and it's sort of our contemporary relationship. But in reality, its historical origin is in the temple. Like, I think Hudson also talks a little bit about how, like, the Greeks, like Greek kings, Roman kings, had a lot of trouble managing like the various cults, like the various deities, Apollo, priests of Artemis, etc., who would fight amongst themselves and fight each other, hoarding wealth and competing with each other, right? So when the king comes in, it's to sort of serve as a mediator, an authority between those priests who manage the information systems, right, for the economy to go on, and the regular producers. So yeah, I guess when in faith, I mean, like, in terms of concrete faith, like it really is the priests coming up with the money and all the and managing all the rituals and whatnot associated with actually consuming labor time. Because the other thing Hudson talks a lot about is how kings and priests actually conducted labor. Like the whole building of like pyramids and great works and other public works was like sort of on a sort of festival schedule. Like, it was very aligned with their like their astrology and their particular religious practices. So religion becomes baked into like the actual labor and obligations that these farmers are expected to perform on behalf of the palace, which is really interesting, you know.
You guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Cool.
Sorry, yeah, you sound good. Go ahead, Solar.
Cool. Yeah, sorry. I don't know why the connection is so horrible today. I don't think it's the transition to StreamYard specifically has been difficult, so I apologize for that. I wanted to build off of what Seth said, but also address the question that you had asked me as well. And this also ties into what Joshua had said about faith and how I kind of deal with this. So you're right. I'm not left wing, but I am and remain essentially a traditionalist, right? So I mean, like, so for instance, like Evola had a lot to say about capitalism, and most of those things were sharply negative. So I also believe that sort of quote unquote money, debt, and the whole sort of like world of commercial activity should ultimately be brought under the absolute authority of a sort of magician god king, right? And a sort of martial magical aristocracy, more or less, right? And that the sort of untrammeled sort of like sovereignty of debt and the sort of like, whether you want to say the capitalist class, you know, industrial interests, but also like the financialist class, financial interests, both like high and low, has been an unmitigated disaster, right? And it was a disaster in Rome. It's a disaster in our civilization, whether you say that's the same civilization or not, right? This is a persistent problem. I again, like this is a sort of like normative historical account of the sort of priestly origins of money. Ultimately, right, as a traditionalist, I'm going to say that that represents a sort of later and degenerate stage of social organization, right? So ultimately, like that should be brought under the sort of authority of a king, but not a king in the sort of like exclusively sort of secular sense, but in the true sort of regal imperial glory of a sort of like divinized like regnum, right? That would oversee this and basically every aspect of life. So this is all to say that I share, I'm deeply sympathetic to Hudson's critiques, right? And I think he makes a very prescient point when he says that it was when the kings or the sort of the ruling, the sort of like aristocratic elite, the people who were responsible for money, and the polis, when they lost their ability to forgive debts, debt acquired its sovereign absolute character, and that led to the like the slow, or in some cases not so slow, enslavement of much of society in debt slavery, right? And why did they lose that authority, right? I mean, that's complicated. There are a lot of like sort of historical answers to that question. But in a very, very like basic sense, the rulers of the Near East were, well, I mean, they were considered sort of divine figures themselves, but also, as we've talked about at some length in various episodes, you know, in our work here, they would ritually occupy, they would either become the god, be a vessel for the god, right? Like I think we've discussed the mechanics of the bed of Og, specifically mentioned in the Bible, right? As a kind of like prototypical Chaldean ritual device, right, where the king is going to basically have sex with the temple sacred prostitute, and he's going to sort of become a god. He's going to act as the god, impregnating the prostitute. And that's, anyway, so one of the justifications that the Chaldean or the Near Eastern prince would have for forgiving agricultural debts was that ultimately it was the king's and the gods' responsibility to bring agricultural prosperity to the land, right? Like the if you, in a polytheistic sense, right? Like the god of the sky and the rain has to descend and impregnate, like, you know, Mother Earth, so to speak, right, to make the crops grow and do all that fun cyclical stuff, right, that we're also familiar with in the sort of the age of the mother. And if Marduk didn't get the job done, right, if Marduk couldn't get it up in a given year and the crops didn't grow very well, then how could the temple be expected to, you know, get everything back, right? Like Marduk hadn't provided, and so he didn't expect the return, right? And of course, like, it's going to be the priest or the sort of divine kings, like almost like responsibility to just as a formality say, like, yeah, like these debts are wiped off, you know, they're absolved. It's when you lose that chain of causality, right, that this mundane thing that's happening, like this material like shortage of agricultural return, right, that is when you lose the sense that is simply derivative of and reflective of a sort of higher order spiritual reality, right, of what's going on in this sort of metaphysical sense, right, of the gods sort of providing for man, right, and in some ways like the concrete world of material and the world of man simply being a kind of derivative reflection of this sort of higher order spiritual reality. When you lose that, well, then it has to kind of like stand alone, and you enter into the realm of sort of like pure efficiency and pure just calculus in general. And that's where things really go awry, because then the system starts to pursue a sort of logic that is only attendant to itself, right? There's not a sort of like external sort of stabilizing like axiological foundation that grounds it in something outside of itself. And even like from just like a sort of left-wing perspective, that thing outside of itself can just could even be reduced to the overall well-being, stability, resilience of the polis of society, et cetera, right? There are a lot of sort of like non-quantifiable, at least in a sort of short and sort of absolute sense, there are a lot of sort of like inquantifiable things that people might still have good reason to value, right? And that must be protected by sort of like external axiomatic prerogative, right?
That was really well said. Thank you, Solar. I appreciate that. Joshua, for Eros, whomever, do you have any sort of like ideas of how you believe in engaging the text in context to like our contemporary situation or ideological terms?
If you got something, Josh, go ahead.
Well, I didn't actually read it, so I think anybody that has should have precedence over my commentary. But I have other things I can mention. Yeah.
Okay, Eros, just shoot from the hip and tell us what you think, and then I'll let Joshua do his notes thing.
I think that it's just in general an interesting concept. It just raises a lot of questions that I hope that we get to talk about, like why they might have kind of created this idea of a barter system, and how we kind of have I guess basically just that, like why they would have kind of created that narrative. Otherwise, I don't have much commentary right now.
Okay, Joshua, go. Let's hear them. Let's hear all the notes.
Oh, I got lots of notes, so don't say that. But I have made references to my notes, like what chapter I think they would probably relate to, so I can at least do that. For chapter 5, I think that this might go back to what Solar was talking about earlier with like the concept of a jubilee or a shemitah. The shemitah is like following the Sabbath day is the seventh day, so like every 7 years you'd have a reset, right, where you'd forgive debts. In some cases, even land would go back to people. And actually, that might have been like more of a jubilee, I think, which is 49, 50 years, right? So at each interval, you'd have these different levels of debt forgiveness. And why is it that we're losing that? And so I was thinking about that kabbalistically, and I think that debt forgiveness maybe relates to chesed, and it's only something that a king can do. You can only have mercy, like you have to be in that authority role, minting currency, having dominion, etc. It's like some type of ability that it's something the king can do to prove that he's king, right? Mercy is something that is like a gift. And so continuing on with like chapter 7 and 8, it talks about the agricultural land resources, these things as like a capital in a sense as well. And since I'm going to bring this topic up maybe anyway, there's like the tokenization of assets beginning, and I think that's something that we're beginning to see as hard money becomes soft money. It shifts from being like gold and silver to more like a fiat currency that doesn't really have a physical form, because with the advent of electricity and the age of Aquarius,
even though we're still in a Saturnian type background or backdrop, if you will, with Aquarius, there's now this like new age type flavor to it. So we still have the old concept of money. We haven't outgrown that apparently, but now it's got like an ethereal quality to it. So I think that's worth noting, because as that occurs, you know, like in my mind, I always think apocalyptically, of course, but you know, you have the lifeblood of a kingdom being like the circulation of the currency, right, within the bounds of its inhabitants and its domain. And there's this concept of money velocity, for instance, where, you know, if money's just sitting in a cave or whatever, then it's not being used. It's not wealth in action, you know. So for it to kind of be like it has to be used, and that's one of the qualities of the money too. I lost it in the chat somewhere, but it has to be like recognizable and stuff. So if it's just sitting somewhere in a hoard, it's not necessarily recognized either. So part of the reason that like in the silver market, I think they call them numismatics or whatever, coins that have been minted are usually seen as more recognizable and therefore more accepted, you know. And I don't know if we talked about counterfeiting at one point, but it reminds me of the Eureka effect, how Archimedes was tasked with trying to figure out if gold was legit or not. And, you know, when he eased himself into a bath, he experienced epiphany, which, you know, I think when water touches the skin, it can do that. But anyway, when he had that epiphany, he's like, oh, density, you know, because he displaced water. He's like, I can put the crown in water and the fake crown will displace more water, you know, because it's more dense. And so I think being able to test these things is, there's always like a race against piracy and things like that kind of go alongside these things. So anyway, that's just a interesting conversation to bring, because maybe that's like DAT or something, you know, and being able to discern and use discernment when you're, because, you know, there's a lot of you need to have that in the economic world, apparently, especially these days. Pardon if I had one more note, I think. Oh yeah. And so finally with like the electricity thing, oh, and as far as the circulation of the blood and the electricity, I think of that as like the nerves and the blood vessels, the commerce and everything. Usually roads are where all your lifeblood and electricity flow through a country nowadays. So, you know, they're kind of like living in that sense. But as we get more integrated into the government, and the government and religion are kind of, you know, leading this, I think that Revelation 13 talks about like when the Antichrist kind of becomes like a government and religion merged. And he does something very interesting where he creates a currency, and he mints a currency with his image on it. And so this conversation might be worth having just for that sake, you know, because it's like another throwback to an old Saturnian tradition, something really far and ancient in our past that we've forgotten about. But they used to have to declare fealty to the emperor. I think it was like Kairos Caesar or something like that. They had to throw something into the fire and declare fealty to the emperor. And then they would receive their tesseract or their benefits card for the welfare state. And they were entitled to their bread and circuses and all that jazz. But anyway, thanks so much for letting me weave. I appreciate it.
Sorry about that. Yes, very much appreciated. Thank you, Joshua. Now, I guess I liked your idea of roads. I don't think you said it exactly like this, but this is what I wrote in the chat anyway. Roads as a living system. I think this is like, whether you want to like compare it as an allegory to like the, you know, to the Adam Kadmon, or like the, you know, the primordial man. I like can say it's a circulatory system. Like, I think that's interesting. I've heard Deddy talk about rivers. She's not the only one, obviously. It doesn't even come from her. It's like an old sort of philosophy of religion idea, as rivers as sort of like these primordial vehicles, or the vehicle for primordial knowledge. That's a very that has deep both tantric and sort of Central Asian religious significance. Also relates to that image of Shiva. We're calling him Shiva speculatively. But it relates to him because Shiva is always depicted as the river Ganges, and which is depicted as a goddess. She's always depicted as sort of flowing between his bun, his top knot, which reaches into the upper world. And why is that important? Because I think Seth touched on something, or well, Seth and I touched on something in the chat, which is just that the jubilees sort of have a karmic significance. So if you remember back to that image, I was saying, yes, he's like the opening the treasury of the three worlds. So when he opens the gate of Patalaloka, the hell world, you could call it, that's all our karmic debts. But he's also opening the karmic boons of heaven. So he's sort of equalizing and sort of synthesizing, so rectifying and synthesizing both of the sun and the moon. He's rectifying all those three things in and of himself through the eclipse. And so you could say that there is like as Joshua said, there's a Dathic component. He is the God. That is really what Shiva is. He's the God of secret knowledge. So I do think that there's like an interesting sort of way to tie that in, and like the roles of the temple and what even is the role of currency. And I think Solar brought this up like right at the beginning. Like, was it like just for alchemical purposes to like, obviously Solar said the plebes weren't necessarily handling the money. They were for these sort of like traveling mercenaries. Interestingly, the Roma people, gypsies, they were mercenaries. So it's interesting that their sort of like journey into Europe and their sort of like maintenance of the tradition of metallurgy as well. And obviously we discussed in the speculative anthropologies of Southeast Asia, metallurgy really is the sort of primordial and most, I would say primary even, sort of tantric knowledge. That's what is preserved the best, and that is also what is considered the highest and most difficult sort of resolution to the paradox of the worlds. So anyways, I want to say that anyone can basically say anything they want. If someone has like a point, Solar, if you want to say something, or Seth or Joshua or Eros.
I do have one thing.
Sure.
So we're going to talk about why coins have ridges. I'm done.
Okay. Okay, Solar. Sorry, Solar. Go ahead.
Yeah, no. And ironically, connects to the bad joke there. So it's been a long time since I actually learned any Gemara, right? Formally or informally. But my dogs say hello. Sorry about that, guys. So from what I remember, the consensus on the Jubilee year was that it never actually occurred. Which is a very bizarre thing, right? You're like in Torah, this injunction is very, very clear, right? You have to do this land reset and whatever. And I believe there's basically a rabbinical consensus that this is kind of an ideal situation, but that for a variety of reasons, which I apologize, I don't actually remember because it's been a very long time. But yeah, it's just like a jubilee was never declared. That's not true for the like Sabbath year, the year of rest for the crops and things like that. Like those, according to rabbinical tradition, did happen. But the actual like debt forgiveness and sort of like land allotment reset was just beyond the pale, so to speak, right? And I found this very, very funny, right? Because again, when I was actually learning this stuff, or doing my best to learn this stuff, the Talmud and all that, I had no idea. Like I could not have anticipated for the life of me this stuff that we're talking about in this book. So I kind of was like, oh, well, yeah, man, that is so extreme. Like, massive like debt forgiveness and all that stuff. Like I can totally see why it never happened, right? It's pie in the sky idealism. And then reading this book, it's like, oh yeah, this not only happened regularly, but it was actually like an essential pillar of the functioning of the entire thing. And as soon as it was demolished, the system like slowly like collapsed in on itself, right? I was blown away by that, right? And I'm interested, like one could probably, well, there's a lot you could say about why the sort of post-classical and then the medieval rabbinical commentators would have found the idea of debt forgiveness to be like unthinkable, unworkable, etc. And I guess I just want to point out the striking contrast in sort of perceived viability, right? And it also speaks to this sense in which even by like, I don't know, like the 6th century, I don't know exactly when the particular Braitas are from that deal with this topic in Mishnah, but so it could be from a range. But anyway, it seems like by that point in history, the Rebbeim had almost like lost the contextual knowledge of how pre-classical and early classical society used to function with widespread debt jubilee years, right? In like the Near East. I think that's really interesting, right? Like the idea that like, you know, exilic Jews, but not that far into exile, right? Like writing the Mishnah had already like lost track of what was like the actual like economy, or like this sort of like cyclical economic like character of like Near Eastern city states. Like that's actually kind of incredible, right?
It just shows you that history is so much based in like context and like generational memory. And once it sort of disappears, like I've always give the example, and this is like obviously almost 2000 years in the forward in the future if we go by chronological history, but Indonesia forgot it was a great city state that practiced these exact same debt jubilees in Bali and Java. So you know it completely forgot. It didn't remember it had temples or tantra or anything. So you know that's why I always say it's like I'm so glad you grounded it in like a textual history, and I think that's so important. But it even shows like that is very dependent on view. So yeah, no, I think that was incredible. Okay, so Joshua, do you have anything closing? Seth, Eros, our Solar, anyone?
Well, a penny for your thoughts. You know, because they stopped making pennies, people are going to forget that phrase. So just keep that in mind, I guess. And see you later. That's another chemistry penny joke. Yeah.
Well, copper is sort of interesting because copper is at least one of the 5 sacred metals, and it is the planetary metal of Venus. So I know you brought that up in regards to his headpiece. I don't necessarily think of as everybody knows, I don't necessarily think of the planetary forces in the same way. I think of it in a more tantric or yetziradic kind of astrological configuration. But I do think that there is a kind of mapping you can make of obviously, at least in tantra, you can say that there's an element of Venus, maybe her husk, that is about material wealth. So it would make sense. Copper comes from deep inside the earth. It's shiny like gold. It's malleable. It's conductive to electricity. It's and we don't consider it of like particularly high value in the last like couple hundred years, but actually it is because it's used to make all of our technology. It's highly dependent on copper, gold, and silver.
Well,
and like all the other ones.
They add copper to coins to help it last longer because one of the qualities is that it has to be durable. So actually pure silver isn't really durable. In fact, if when a coin's pure, if we were to pass American Eagles or the Canadian maple leaves, they're a lot cheaper for some reason. But if we were to pass those around, they would actually wear a lot quicker and more so than like a Morgan or Peace dollar or whatever. So you think about that astrologically then, right? You got silver, which is the moon, but then there's like a preservation quality to copper in Venus. So we know so the moon has what, a 19-year cycle, the mimetic cycle, and then you got Venus with its 8-year cycle, I think. So maybe there's something to consider there with the 19 metonic cycle, I think it's called. The 19 and the 8, perhaps. Maybe there's, I don't know, because I know you know more about numbers and stuff than I do with that. But anyway, thanks so much for letting me comment.
No, thank you. Oh, sorry, Eros. Yeah, Eros, please go ahead. Sorry about that.
Oh, I just wanted to help Josh out there. the nodes have an orbit that takes 19 years, and yeah, Venus takes 8.
I think that's interesting about the nodes because it's like the meeting of the 9 and the 1. And so, like, obviously in Buddhism, I know I always say this, but like Rahu Ketu, he's one deity. So he's really the 10. He is representative of space, but he's also representative of like the vector to get us to somewhere else, non-dual knowledge, non-dual gnosis, a death, if you want to call it that. So I think it's interesting sort of I think the nodes have a lot to do with wealth. Obviously, if I was better at Jyotisha, I could explain this like more in depth, but he really does have a lot to do with wealth because as I always say, um, Rahu loves to sit in front of Venus. That's one of his favored positionalities. Obviously, he also loves to sit in front of Saturn. But because he loves to sit in front of Venus, you could say that one of his qualities is sort of like the material or sensual world. And I'm not saying it's nothing to do with eroticism necessarily. It's about like the things that money can buy. That's really so he really enjoys that kind of world. But he's a malleable figure. So again, and his metal is sort of disputed, but it's often, at least in Tantric Buddhism, we would say it is of meteorite iron, which is actually a composite alloy, which is composite of multiple different metals and then trace like spatial metals. So I think it's really interesting. I think it's like you can tell like what sort of metals are preferenced in certain ages. It matches very well to like an axial age understanding of both like the economic cycles and also like our historical and I like the way Solar put it. It sounded very like Cuban, like a social spiritual. So I appreciate that.
I would also like to add one thing that if you have kids or work with kids or have kids in your family, start giving them money. I don't mean like a lot. I mean, get them familiar with handling coins and stuff because I've been noticing that not only are kids not able to sign their name, which is an interesting topic in of itself concerning like sigils and signatures and things like that, but also just the fact that they can't even make change a lot of times when you are trying to shop somewhere, like they have to get a calculator out and stuff. And it's just so foreign to them because everything's becoming so digital. So I like to think of money as like some type of analog. It's a skill. I mean, we don't normally think about it that way, but money handling is a skill. And I think also, I've been given like when the kids in my family graduate or whatever, I'll give them like a silver walking liberty or whatever, and just and tell them to watch the price of silver or whatever, just so that they're kind of aware of that. So this is something that's like a legacy thing that you can kind of pass on, and so you can't really do that once money becomes digital. And so I think there's something to consider there about how they're interfering with the inheritance of wealth and in a very subversive kind of way too, because you can't pay your land tax ahead of time. And so you have to kind of like remain in this system, whether you like it or not. So at some point, it's like people have a foot, no matter, even the Amish are going to have like a foot in the old world and still have to go pay their fucking tax, So anyway, thanks so much. That was my last spiel, I hope.
Well, I just want to comment lastly, or like I want Seth to sort of close us out, or Solar, either or both. But I want to comment on the sort of nature of cryptocurrency. We've talked about this a lot in the past, not recently, but in my opinion, in my sort of like mid-tier metaphysician ideas, I always say that the cryptocurrency is, or not the cryptocurrency. I truly sound like a boomer tonight. I apologize. Cryptocurrency is of the subtle world. So it is of Ketu. So Eros brought up the nodes. Well, that's an idea is like once currency goes digital, like who controls it? What is its nature? And can it be reset? I just want to posit it in more of a speculative way. I'm not saying that I'm not like I'm not weighting it on either side. I just think it's an interesting way to sort of think about it. If it is of the quality of Ketu, it is of that subtle world, it is invisible, it is in the digital. what does it mean? And like, how do we contextualize it? And then what is the metal of Ketu? The metal of Ketu is actually the flux of the past civilizations. Or you can say it is the flux, the particulates of metal that exist in space that are also resultant of production, of actual welding. This is something that we talked about very much at the beginning of the Gray Lodge, but haven't really returned to. But welding produces flux. So those little metal particulates, when they're met, usually traditionally with tree gum, like frankincense, like incenses of the temple. You can use copal, you can use pine tar. There's a lot of different things, or pine gum, excuse me, not pine tar, but you can use different natural fluxes. Now there are, of course, lots of artificial ones now, but that's really traditionally how what you would do for welding. So there is a welding and a K-ball metaphor in there somewhere. It's that it's very much of that Hokmah nature. It's very much in flux. We haven't put it all together yet, and we haven't quite figured it out. So we have to be open. So I thought this went great. Oh, sorry, I see you unmuted yourself. Please go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to close with something, and it's cool that you just teed me up actually about the flux of previous aeons and civilizations. So, because I've been thinking about copper for going on 15 minutes, and well, one, I'm reminded just of the very obvious association in Hebrew between nachashet, which is copper, and nachash, which is snake. Right. So there's this inherent sense in which copper is sort of the metal of the serpent of the sort of like Atlantean age. Right. Also, sidebar, one of my favorite Lubavitcher drashes, there's a classic drash on the sort of significance of the three metals with respect to temple donations. Anyway, if you want a good heartwarming Rebbe moment, you can open up your Chumash and read that. But yeah, back to the weird stuff. So copper is really interesting, right? Because I would invite you perhaps to think, not you, Jin, but listener, to think about the meaning of copper, right? So within the context of the sort of the primitive like Iron Age conditions of the Israelite people, when the Torah was either actually written or even like in its own mythology, it was still in the super early Iron Age, or it would have been like on the other end of the Bronze Age collapse, right? So from their perspective, copper it had very little value in and of itself. Right now, it's incredibly useful for all kinds of industrial applications, as are most metals, right? But at this point, they have lost the ability to essentially make bronze at scale, right? The trade networks that linked, Britain and Afghanistan and Cyprus to provide the tin and the copper to produce bronze, and like all the sort of flow of capital that had enlivened the whole like Eastern Mediterranean and Near East for millennia had sort of fallen apart. And so copper for them was the least valuable of the gold, silver, copper, right? It was it was bottom tier. But then you'll encounter the sort of the remnants of glory, the remnants of the Atlantean age, or the heroic age, excuse me, in the armor of Goliath, right? Of Goliath, this man out of time. And he still has his bronze armor, right? And it glimmers in the sun and strikes fear into the Israelite hosts, right? Because there was a time, there is this kind of memory, right, of a time when copper could be transmuted and synthesized and sort of elevated into something much greater than the sum of, its parts. And in fact, like sort of it possessed initiatic potential, so to speak, that it no longer had, right? That it had this and it had it no longer. And this is, I think, sure, you can say this is kind of interesting to think about in terms of like material stuff and history and whatever. But you can also like analogize this to to social structures, like explicitly, right? Like you can think of like what is in the same way that you can ask like what is the meaning of copper, and how does the meaning of copper change over time through history? How is that like, you know, sort of contextually mediated? Like those are all questions that you can and should ask about like yourself as an individual, right? And like the people around you, right? Like we are we of like the Western like left-hand path orientation, right? We like to talk about like the absolute sovereignty of the individual and the isolate intelligence and all of these things, right? And those are definitely like an important pole. And those might be seen as the sort of like fruits of ultimate like success and liberation in our efforts. But at the same time, like, you know, we are enmeshed in these superstructures which determine all sorts of facets of our lives and, you know, the sort of character of our realities, right? Even if we see those as chains, even if we see them as fetters, they are still extant, right? And in a sense, like the individual is itself like the product of context. In fact, the individual is the product of many different contexts, right? This is you know, we live in a postmodern world. Or we always have, but we recognize that now. So anyway, just some like kind of questions to ask, as the text itself doesn't really get into the idea of society as superorganism. But I think we got into the sort of like biological metaphors of circulation, of exchange, of sort of like growth and decay. And those kind of reach, I think, their full expression in a properly sort of like post-Hegelian context. So I think there's a lot there that we can work with, and I'm excited to continue on with the book. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Solar. That was truly excellent. I'm so glad you brought up the idea of bronze, because that is also the idea of tantra. It is also sort of the idea of like adamantization is partly is like that, a sort of alloy and synthesis. So it's very much associated with the Kumara, actually. Like that's what synthesis is. It's really associated with the sun. If you want to go in a very like a Vedic, post-Vedic, Upanishadic, Puranic, tantric idea, this is sort of a continued thread. And if you obviously, I know Solar's listened to it, and pretty much everyone has heard me talk about it. And Joshua was obviously there for a lot of it too. But like the Aeon of the Daughter stuff, it's like the idea of the sun is this idea of like the Bronze Age, and this sort of synthesis of these different ideas, metals, very materially, these metals that sort of also produce an alchemical change in the Upasaka. And in that sort of perceptual interaction with alchemy, like Solar so brilliantly said, we are now aware of the postmodernity of the world. Well, that is the sort of the secret fifth consciousness, you could say. It's like our interaction with these six consciousness, which is what the Skanda or the Kumara is. He has six consciousness, like six heads usually. So it's usually six metals or five metals plus an energetic source, usually lightning, but it can also be six metals. There's different sort of configurations and reconfigurations. And, but our perception of those sort of interactions of the natural phenomena, plus our magic words, whatever, however you understand that, whether you call it the logos or the mantra or the bija or the, you know, ritual technologies. Obviously, I would just say it is sound. It is like the mantra in space. It is like captured. That is sort of like how we activate the true alchemical process. The true initiatic journey is in the synthesis of those metals. So I just think that's interesting. Bronze is very much associated for me with the Aeon of the Sun. I don't disagree with you though that copper does have an element of like a serpentine, at least, nature, especially because like Joshua said this, like copper is a snakebite treatment. And so, and there's a lot of like anti-toxic qualities to copper, which makes also sense in attribution to Venus, because a lot of Venus herbs are against the toxins of Mars specifically. So serpents and those kind of things, it would be all herbs of Venus are very emollient and sort of neutralizing. That's a kind of a good idea. They're cool, but they're not cold. They're soft, but they're not, it's not necessarily, it's not weak. there's a kind of strength to it. So I think that all makes sense. And like that Rahu Venus connection, obviously the serpent and the whatever you want to call her, the mother, the maiden. I mean, I have different ideas because obviously I come to the tree very differently, but I think that I think there's an inherent connection, obviously. So,
Hey, can I ask one thing?
absolutely, Joshua. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, damn, it left my mind. I can't believe that happened. You know what? It's going to come back here in like a couple moments. I'm so sorry.
That's okay. Seth, why don't you?
Oh, I remember now.
Okay, go for it.
Because Solar was here and Eros is here, and I was like, oh man. So I wanted to ask. They put coins on the eyes of the dead, right? So, like, can you guys maybe talk about that and if that has some significance here in the discussion? Because that's like Pluto kind of deal, like passing into the underworld. And all
Sure.
That.
Yeah, let's talk about that. That's a great question. Solar, sorry, Solar, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, I was gonna suggest, because I think a few of us have already like given our kind of closing sort of statements.
Yeah, I know,
the
but
recording. No,
yeah.
but I was gonna, and I was actually, I'm glad you kind of brought this up because I would put this out to the audience too, like asynchronously. So I love to start recordings with kind of a like mailbag and questions. Like when I would, when I used to run my lectures, I would do the same thing, right? Like I would start by kind of like establishing a continuity with whatever we had talked about previously, right? So like maybe we can do that with your question that you just asked, but also if other people like have comments, questions, whatever, I would love to kind of aggregate those and sort of open up with those before we pivot to part 2 of the book for the next episode of the series. Just a suggestion, put it out there.
No, that's cool, man. It's like saving a piece of dessert for later. I love it.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, we'll
Very,
totally do
very
that.
Taurus.
That works. That works great. I mean, it is solar series, so let's we'll go with it. I think that's a great large convention. So let me open it up to Seth and then obviously Eros. Seth, what was your overall impression? How do you feel? Do you feel like we did Micheal Hudson justice? I feel like we did. I'm really proud of it, like everything that was said. I feel like I didn't bring as much as I normally would, but that's okay because it's not my wheelhouse, like I'm out of my depth a little, but I'm learning. But Seth, you know a lot, so why don't you say something clever and make me look clever by proxy?
The only thing I wanted to bring up, and maybe it's a good closing statement, sort of like how I opened up in the chat with the meme or the GIF of from the Odyssey, Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey, because I really think, and it's such a timely, like the fact that that movie was released and now we're talking about Temples of Enterprise, because if you were to rewatch that movie with this sort of interpretive framework that Hudson provides about Bronze Age antiquity, then the movie becomes less so like, like an allegory for, the Iraq War, and more so the sin that Western civilization has committed against its origins in the Near East, right? Like Odysseus, America, is languishing on an island, eating the lotus of the lotus flower, trying to forget, its duty, its obligation. And like Odysseus, eventually at some point we're gonna have to stop eating the lotus flower and perform our duty. We're gonna have to go back home and clean house and restore the authority of the king, as it were, because that is kind of what Hudson really posits in his like polemic against this myth, because by polemicizing the myth of liberalism about barter and whatnot, he's really polemicizing that particular menial class of people who are trying to tell a story about themselves, right? What he's asserting is that no, in reality, there's like this sort of alternate history that's been suppressed, but just as that Bronze Age collapsed, right, and this menial financial class, it's as if the suitors in the Odyssey prevailed over Odysseus, if we can imagine that. At some point, however, that regal authority will reassert itself, or at least the possibility exists for it to reassert itself. And all the degeneration that, our civilization experiences can be rectified, as it has been in the ancient past. So that's like the sort of historical memory. The movie, I think, is sort of unconsciously evocating, and what Micheal Hudson lays out in his account of Bronze Age economies. So it's a very, very powerful and inspiring piece of literature. It really forms the core animus of, like, I would say the modern iteration of the Communist Party in America, especially. It's what distinguishes it, like, from previous modes of American leftism broadly. It's a very important book. It's really glad we got the opportunity to discuss it.
Well, I like to do books that you guys actually want to read, not just ones that I mean, of course I want to do ones that I pick, but the reality is like I can't do a book club on my own. Like it doesn't really make sense. It's not our tradition. It's not how we've ever done it. So it makes more sense for me to choose things that are, of the people, listen a little bit, and that's good for me. You did say something really interesting, Seth, metaphysically, before I let Eros go, is that you can rectify synthesis produces aggregates, at least in a tantric way. And so you have to rectify those aggregates. Well, we would say in the fifth density, or at the, on a moon disk. So we'll just use like very tantric iconographical terms. So synthesis happens at the sun disk, and rectification happens at the moon disk. But both of those things are sort of synthesized together. Both of those things, those like secret processes, you could say, are synthesized together through the eclipse, through the great dragon of the black sun. So I don't know, there's something very interesting. So you can actually, so if you're saying like the sort of like the Bronze Age formation, it was like maybe that was the pinnacle, and then this like mercantile class, this class of like sort of mercenary traders, they've sort of are the cause of the degradation of the worlds, maybe speculatively. I'm not saying that you're saying it so simplistically. I'm just sort of giving it my narrative, and that makes sense. And then we move through the aeons, and then we're back. We're in an aeon of rectification. So we're going to pull all that, all the flux. We can save the flux. It can be saved. Maybe even like the West can be saved. Maybe, and I know we're all against empire. We're all against Zog, all of that. Okay. Everybody knows I'm like very hippie. I'm like the most anti-war person probably on the panel. I'm just very, I mean, I don't know if that's true, but I know everybody's like very anti-empire. So it kind of works that we did this book as well in that way. So I do think the restriction of the imperial borders back to the natural formation of the continent, I think that is maximal Malkuth. I've talked to Solar about this before, so I apologize, but that he's hearing it for the like fifth time or whatever it is, but many times over. But I do believe in like the idea of like we bring those things back into the quote unquote primordial ground that is the place that we live, and we sort of shore up our borders from there, like create the riches on the coin, you could say. I don't know. I don't even know what that joke really means. I'm just being honest. I'm not that terminally online enough, I guess. But Eros, why don't you say any closing remarks that you have, and of course plug your channel, which is of course in the show notes, as is Solar's Substack, Joshua's X account, and Seth's X account. And of course, a look out for multiple episodes from every single person on this panel. Thank you guys so much. And I'll say a couple housekeeping words at the end, but Eros, please say whatever you want.
Yeah, this was a great episode. It really laid a good foundation. I'm really excited to look deeper into it. I think it's also interesting when we're talking about Pluto, money can also be kind of an allegory for sacrifice. And I like that Seth brought up the Odyssey, not just because I went and saw it last night and I really liked it, but it's, throughout the movie, they're talking about Zeus's law, right? Like extending goodwill to people. And I feel like this is kind of a similar concept to that as well, where you're crediting goodwill. And so maybe things started out that way, but likewise how, that movie kind of marks the end of the Bronze Age and the Heroic Age and the Age of Aries. We're kind of headed towards the end of our own age here, the age of Pisces, in the next 140 years. So I think that these themes are really heightened now, and I'm just kind of excited to see where this goes. And to dig into it deeper. And I really appreciate Seth and Solar, because you guys were really great tonight. Just I feel like you guys taught me a lot, and I was thoroughly intrigued. So again, great episode. You can find me on YouTube at Aerosup and Twitter at Ethos. Thanks for having me on. Great talking with you guys tonight.
Yeah, thank you so much, Eros. And like Seth is saying in our little private chat, I guess, is that next week or whenever we do it, it'll be pending Solar's schedule. So we'll do things maybe in between whatever his Fridays look like. No pressure, Solar, of course. But we'll work around it. We'll figure it out. But yeah, I really appreciated that. I thought you did great. We want to hear you more on astrology, so hopefully we can do that in regards to the book. I think we're all very much on the, no pun, same page. And I think this was a really great episode. Like, I'm so proud of us. I wasn't nervous about how any of you would interpret the book, but I was kind of nervous to do something that wasn't inherently metaphysical. But then I realized, like, yeah, there's a lot you can draw from all of this alchemy, planetary ideas, and also sort of the secret history, the alternative history, the speculative history. I think that draws very much into everything that we've done for the whole time, and I try to do on the other show, and of course all of you with me when you are with me, and even when you're not. So yeah, special shout out to Solar and Seth. It makes a lot of sense, right? SS, there you go. But yeah, you guys did great. I'm so glad that, Seth, you suggested the book and that Solar approved it, so we could do it. And like, I want to do things that you guys again want to do. So part 2 and 3 is arc 2 and 3 it's incoming. And I want to say shout out to Vanessa. I'm so sorry that I didn't shout you out before. Of course, Cassandra. So first of all, shout out Vanessa at Truth and Dies. Check out her Etsy. She is a part of our group. Appreciate you. Of course, Cassandra, who has an upcoming episode on Threshold Saints. The next episode will be Cassandra's. If you haven't checked out the episode with Mac, please do. If you you don't have to, but if you like Wolf Cop, or if you like werewolves, or we actually talked a lot about Canadian cinema, so maple cinema, as he coined it. He's quite a good little bard himself. And so yeah, check that out. But Cassandra's episode will be coming out Monday. I think it'll be really cool to sort of like have a voice that is like, usually I've had mostly men, and that's fine, and I'm more comfortable with that, to be honest. But girls kind of scare me, but it is what it is. So yeah, I think it'll be interesting to have like a girl from the lodge. I think it's our first one. So, and then obviously Eros will come out in the next 2 weeks. So that'll be really awesome, because she obviously doesn't, she goes toe to toe with me, and so does Cassandra. They don't give me any room to shuffle around. So thank you guys so much. Appreciate all of you. I will upload this on the regular feed within like 24 or 48 hours. And all of everybody's links are in the, in the description. So check it out. And everybody have a great night. And, you know, like the world is a truly hyperspace kingdom if you want it to be. That's what I think.